Hello, everybody. So today I'm going to be going over, firstly, the claims that Donald Trump won 2016 by cheating, and secondly, that the claims that he won by cheating were fake and were a deliberate setup and a hoax. So they're kind of two separate issues, but they are related. So obviously, when the 2016 election happened, Donald Trump won, and he won with, I believe it was the smallest proportion of the votes in US history. So he did not win the majority of the votes. Now, USA is not the only country in the world that allows one person to win without having the majority of the votes. A lot of countries have a straight by the post thing. I think Germany is by the post, but then they always have complicated mergers. So you'll have the one that wins will be a combination of five different parties, and then the one that loses is a combination of three other different parties, and it's about who allies with who and all this sort of stuff. Here in Australia, we have preferential voting. So at our last election, for example, um, so the two main parties are Labor and Liberal, and I believe they got 41 and 31% of the vote. So between them, 72. And the third party, the Greens, got, I think, about 25%. So there wasn't we very nearly had a different second party. And that's in fact what it's designed for here in Australia. And in Australia, we have it set up into different electorates. So an electorate is usually around 30 to 35,000 people. And if you get the most votes in that election, that little 35,000 parcel, you get one vote in the, I'm not sure what it's called, but the Australian equivalent of the Electoral College. And in America, it's very strange how they do it because if we did it like that in Australia, then, it'd be very different. And in America, of course, they have it so that instead of getting just for one electorate, and they do have electorates, they actually have it so that if you win a state, depending on how many people live in that state, you get all of the votes for that state. So that certainly doesn't happen here in Australia. So if you win a state, for example, let's say you win Tasmania, and I think Tasmania has eight eight seats. That's what we call it. We call it seats. If they, and I think they have. Actually, I don't think they have eight seats. I think they have six. But if you had six seats, it could be four for Labor and two for Liberal, or it could be five for Labor and one for Liberal. And it depends on your margin. And they don't do that. It's just in the American system, you just get all six, no matter what. Except that there's a couple of states that then decide that you get one for the overall and one for each part. And it's put simply, I'd say that the American system is an appalling system that sets itself up to be extremely open to corruption. And now, I don't think 2016 was the first example of that. Now, I don't know what it was like before 2000, but I certainly know that 2000 exposed the level of corruption in American politics in their electoral system. And I think everyone since then, and I've looked at 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, and 2024, all of them were corrupt. Certainly compared to Australia's, and I'd say compared to ones like Germany, Great Britain, um, and France, and all the other ones that I've been aware of. Now, that's not to say that America's one is the most corrupt in the world. We obviously had one, for example, in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein used to get 99% of the vote, and there's been some countries where they've got 120% of the vote. 120%. I'd say that America's corruption level is probably a similar level to India's as far as their electoral system. India's is considered to be very bad, but still fair. And I think that's probably similar to what it's like in USA. Now, a lot of people complain about Russia's. I have heard complaints about that, and I've also heard people say that it was good. I'm not sure that Russia's is more corrupt than America's. I'd actually, from what I know of Russia's, they're less corrupt than America's, but it's probably fairly close. Ukraine, I'd probably have said that between 1991 and 2014, Ukraine was relatively good. And I'd say that since 2014, when they had the Maidan Revolution, Ukraine's gone way downhill. And I'd probably put them today at worse than Russia. Yeah, I'd definitely put them behind America, but still not as bad as some of these, and I don't know what other countries are going in the world, but if there's anyone that's getting 99% of the vote, like North Korea technically is a democracy. Well, the same party happens to have won like for 70 years in a row. Yeah, no, North Korea would be the most corrupt. I don't think anyone's suggesting that America rises to that level. Ukraine doesn't rise to that level. I'd say Ukraine is extremely corrupt, but not North Korea level. And I'd say, that's if you're saying that they are, then you're being a bit silly. Um, yeah, and I mean, I mean, there are arguments that say, well, you've got a forever leader. Um, and there is that argument, and I think that's quite valid. But there's also a reasonable amount of transparency in their system. And I think that as a voting system, I mean, not counting the fact that if you say the wrong thing, you might be killed, which is obviously a factor. And that probably does realistically put Russia behind America. And I think we've got to be realistic there. Um, and like there are different voting systems around the world, and there are some which aren't democracies. There's a number of countries that are not democracies and don't pretend to be democracies. And even Great Britain, for example, which has a democracy, they also have a monarchy behind it. And there's a number of countries like that, and there's different systems around the world. But certainly, I don't think that excuses America's system. So America's system is essentially they're a republic. So they're a democracy behind a republic. So essentially, America's system is set up like the United Nations. So you know how in the United Nations you have different countries with however the hell they decide they're representing them, and the United Nations does not care, and then they get to vote on things. And of course, the United Nations has one vote per country, and some of the countries are 16,000 and others are a billion or more than a billion, and they get one vote each. And then, of course, you have the five founding members that all have veto power. They can just undo everything. Like you could have 99% of the countries agree, but America goes, nope, it doesn't happen. Like, for example, we had the Russia said, let's denounce Nazism, and they put that to the United Nations. Every country except for Ukraine and USA said yes to it, at least when it was initially proposed. And I mean, nowadays it's 50-50, but initially it was, yeah, every country but USA got to say, nah. You know, it essentially means they can't do anything against the USA, Russia, China, United Kingdom, or France. They're immune from everything. They can just do whatever the hell they want. So, yeah, so when we're looking at that in the context of America, I don't think there's any doubt that there were issues in 2016. Um, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And there's also, you know, Russia, of course, they want to manipulate the American system. China do too. And there's claims that Iran does. I'd be shocked if Iran was big enough or powerful enough to make any difference whatsoever. Iran is a tiny country that has no real ability to do anything. The two countries that would be most interested in um, manipulating America would be Russia and China. And I mean, okay, you can say, well, okay, Iran is complicit with Russia and China. Sure, I can agree with that, but their level of power is much smaller. You can probably also say North Korea is essentially a proxy state of China, and that they would probably be involved as well. Yes, I can agree with that, but again, they're a lot smaller. So I think we have to look at Russia and China now. They say 2016, oh, Russia were involved in manipulating things, and I'm sure they were. I don't think there's any doubt that they were, and indeed, everyone has accepted that they have. But they did. Um, but suggesting that they were only involved in 2016 would be a lie, and that's the thing that people sort of miss. I'd say since 1949, Russia have been involved, and why I say 1949 because that's when the Cold War began. They might have taken a break after the fall of the Soviet Union. That was 1991, but by 2014, I'd say Russia were back up again. So, because 2014 was the Russian annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, and of course, America were involved in that. and that was also the main revolution in Ukraine, and that changed things. So I'd probably say from 1991 to 2014, there probably was less interest in Russia manipulating America. So this would be connected to the main revolution, the annexation of Crimea and all of that. And I'd say, yeah, Russia would want to get involved. And the reason why Russia would want to get involved is because they want to have Crimea recognized as being part of USA. They want to have Ukraine go back to having Viktor Yanukovych in charge, who was the guy that Russia liked. And he was voted democratically, and you can say that was corrupt. I disagree with you. But I'd say the majority of people in Ukraine genuinely wanted him in power. I know he had poor support by the time that he was deposed, but when he was voted in, he won quite a big margin. Now I know that he previously had corruption and all that, but you know, suffice to say, it wasn't just Yanukovych that was alone. There were all of the political parties in Ukraine that were popular from when they were granted independence in 1991 through to the main revolution in 2014 were all pro-Russia. Now, there were communist parties, there were Nazi parties, there were other parties, but they never were very popular. And the the anti-Russian parties that, such as uh, what's his name, Petro Poroshenkov and Vladimir Zelensky were a part of, they were not popular votes. They only came in after the main revolution, after they banned all the big ones. So people didn't really have a choice. And I've explained that that's essentially like if you can imagine in Australia, from Australia's perspective, that we have Labor and Liberal as our two major parties, and somebody just came in and said, right, we're banning Labor and Liberal. You can only vote for Greens now. So, okay, who else can we vote for? I can vote for Greens, or you can vote for this gun lobby that nobody cares about. Oh, or you can vote for the Pirate Party or the Sex Party that get like three votes per year. They're your options. Well, I guess we'll vote Green then. And that's really what happened in Ukraine. The third most popular party, which was getting 20% of the vote, suddenly was the only one that they could vote for. I mean, they could vote for even smaller parties, and people really have sort of understated what that revolution did because they banned major political parties. They didn't ban minor ones. I mean, they had previously banned the Communist Party, but and I'm not sure if they've completely banned Svoboda or the different Nazi parties, but they certainly haven't banned Nazism. They're perfectly okay with Nazism, but suffice to say that there was it was the restriction of what you could decide to do that was the big issue, and so Russia definitely wanted that to change. So there's no doubt that that created a renewed interest in America, in Russia, in being involved in American politics. And that interest probably wasn't there since 1991, would have been the last time. Probably, realistically, probably not, because the Soviet Union kind of really quickly fell apart, probably starting around 1998, 99, or 1988 or 1989. And so USSR actually reached their peak around 1984, 85, which is shocking considering that they completely disbanded in 1991. So they went from their absolute peak, and that were around, since 1917. So they had 74 years, and it took them 67, 68 years out of that to reach their peak. They reached their peak in 1984 at the time of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics and soon afterwards. At that point, the Soviet Union could have rolled tanks through and conquered the entirety of Europe with very little resistance, and they could have invaded and defeated USA. Now we didn't know that at the time. We only found that out like 1994. The Soviet Union didn't know that at the time. They didn't realize that they were that powerful. And in fact, it was because they spent so much on their military that caused the collapse, because they were preparing for a war that never happened. They thought that they were about to be invaded by USA. They thought that as soon as the Olympics were over, USA were going to invade Soviet Union. They needed all this defense. They're just waiting, going, Never happened. And that caused the collapse. They overspent on defence, couldn't spend enough on infrastructure and keeping things going. But it is, if they had actually been aware, and you've got to have some credit to American intelligence in hiding that from them, if they had been aware of how powerful they were, not only would the Soviet Union still exist today, but America wouldn't. Or perhaps America would exist in a very defensive way as a minor power. And you would have the Soviet Union would have stretched all the way through Europe. And I don't think they had an interest in Asia or Africa or South America or any of that, but it would have stretched all the way through Europe. They might have even conquered and defeated China. And I know you might say, "Oh, but China's their friend." Well, probably not in 1984. They could have taken China and maybe taken a lot of Asia as well, and or they could have forced China to go along with them. There, that was a scenario where they were very, very powerful. So the thing is that because of the Iron Curtain and the way it worked, they probably weren't able to influence American elections. So 2016 probably marked the time when they were most interested in interfering with the American election and most capable. And that relates to the main revolution in Ukraine. Now, Russia also were involved in the 2020 and the 2024 elections as well. And you'll note that Trump did not win in 2020. Now, if Russia wanted Trump to win, you'd think that Trump would have won in 2020 as well. Um, the other thing to note is that Russia in 2016 were not the most powerful country in the world. They were in 1984. Again, just want to highlight that. There was about a year where the Soviet Union, which is again not just Russia, that's Russia times two. In terms of population, it was twice the population of Russia, but and nowhere near twice the area, but twice the population. Russia was the main part of the Soviet Union, but it's not the same entity. Um, and it was based in Russia, but there were other countries that were sort of forced, according to a lot of people. But some people were quite happy to be part of the Soviet Union. Anyway, so some places want to go back. But yeah, certainly 2016 probably marked the stage where Russia were most interested in getting America to change their policies. And this was because of um, the main revolution. And now a lot of people have said and have pointed out that Barack Obama and the USA were severely involved in the main revolution. It helped America to no end, and it also was, I think, in Russia was seen in many ways as a betrayal because Russia had been trying to be friendly with America, which they tried to do from the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And America was still treating them as if they were still the Soviet Union, still their major enemy. And I think Russia were very upset about that. So they most definitely wanted to get involved in the American political system. Now, the thing is, did they want Donald Trump in power? And the simple answer to that is no. It's not that they didn't want him in power, but they didn't really see it as being Democrats versus Republicans. From Russia's point of view, Democrats and Republicans are both bad because they both hurt Russia, they both hurt the Soviet Union. So and this is one thing that people need to understand, is that while the Soviet Union was fighting the Cold War, so this was 1949 to 1991, USA didn't just have the same party in power the whole time. Some of the time they had Democrats, some of the time they had Republicans. Didn't matter whether it was Democrats or Republicans, they were all against the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union don't see Republicans or Democrats as being friends or enemies. They're both enemies. And the ones that actually brokered the end of the Soviet Union was, of course, Ronald Reagan, who was a Republican, and then they had Bill Clinton, a Democrat. They had George Bush Senior, Republican. They had George Bush Jr., a Republican. George W. We all called him W at the time. And of course we've had Barack Obama, a Democrat. So they've had Democrats and Republicans that they've been dealing with. Now, you might say, all right, well, it was a Republican, Ronald Reagan, who saw the fall of the Soviet Union. And but does Russia think that was a good thing? Probably not. They'd actually be pretty angry about Ronald Reagan. And then they'd say, okay, but Barack Obama oversaw the main revolution and he's a Democrat. So they'd be angry with Democrats. So they'd be angry with both sides. So let's be realistic here. They did not care whether a Republican or a Democrat won. What they cared about was trying to undermine their leadership, no matter who it was. And that's what they were interested in. So they obviously had leverage over Donald Trump. Donald Trump, um, prior to that, had been involved and exposed by WikiLeaks as having the fraudulent Trump University. This was where he created a university that gave degrees that weren't recognised. People had to pay a lot of money for these degrees that then they'd go out and go try to get a job, and people would say, no, that's not a degree. We don't recognise that. So it was a bit of a scam, a bit of an education scam. And so Russia knew about that, and they were wanting to manipulate Trump with that. And they also knew that, of course, Trump had he'd had real estate dealings in Russia and in Moscow and so forth. So they knew that they could manipulate him. Now, they weren't really expecting him to win. Had they expected him to win, they probably would have prepared for a bit of manipulation. Now, with Hillary Clinton, of course, they already had the knowledge that she was involved in essentially the overthrow of the Australian government in 2008. Now, that was she was doing that as her Secretary of State duties on behalf of Barack Obama, and of course, it deposed Kevin Rudd because he was too friendly with China, and then told the lie that his own party didn't like him, or alternatively, that there were some people that died installing free insulation because they didn't set that up very well. But that was actually Peter Garrett's fault, but it was blamed on Kevin Rudd because he oversaw Peter Garrett. So, there was this whole thing, and Hillary Clinton had threatened to kill or threatened to have executed or tried for treason and then executed for the leader of WikiLeaks, which was Julian Assange. So Russia knew that, and they knew that if she got in power, they'd be able to leverage that against her, and they'd be able to expose that she was involved in this thing in Australia. So again, in Australia, very loyal to USA, we're very supportive. So for them to do that to us was really quite a big betrayal, and to offer to kill or threaten to kill one of our citizens for doing that, Julian Assange is an Australian citizen, was horrendous. And she being if she was in power, that sort of thing would be exposed, and Russia would want to push that narrative. And essentially, Russia's aim was to get Americans to fight with each other, and their ultimate aim was to get to get USA to make concessions about Ukraine and get Ukraine to be friendly with Russia again. And that was really one of their main end goals. So why were they then suggesting that this interference was aimed at getting Donald Trump in power? And I'll just note that there were no intelligence briefings that suggested that to be the case. So none of the reports said Donald Trump won because Russia helped him. There were none that did that. If there had been any, he would have been impeached. He had a minority government. You've got to realise he had a minority government, which means that they could impeach him over anything. So ordinarily, with a majority government, how the American system works is you normally form government with a majority government, and so that means that in order to be impeached, you have to have a number of people in your own party as well as all of the opponents to agree that you did the wrong thing, and that of course happened with Bill Clinton with the Monica Lewinsky situation. But the situation with Donald Trump was different because he was in minority government, and that meant that um, they could impeach him over anything, and they did impeach him over anything. And if you looked at the two impeachments, they weren't situations where there were people from his own party that were going against him. And they were more situations of Democrats have the majority, you can be impeached over anything. And you look at the flimsy nature of both impeachments. And the first one, of course, we now know, and we should have known at the time, that Hunter Biden was actually guilty of stuff. And that it was quite reasonable to ask Ukraine to investigate it. Seems reasonable to me at the time, I've got to be honest. It was an absurd thing to impeach over, but they managed to. And then they impeached him over the January 6th riots, the storming of the US Capitol. I think that's a better way to frame it. Which was based on Twitter deleting tweets that proved his innocence. So they were based on misleading intelligence provided by Twitter that made it look like it was completely different to what it was. We only found that out a few years later, but it was at the time did look dodgy. As in, the impeachment looked dodgy, as in they shouldn't have been impeaching him. He was an outgoing president, and you're trying to look at what banning him from running again. It's a strange thing. And we've got to say, impeachment is supposed to be for when someone's gone out of control, and that wasn't the case for either of them. But we also got to state that he had two dodgy impeachments that were mainly about because he had minority government. And he doesn't have minority government now. He's got majority government. He's not being impeached. He's not going to be impeached. Doesn't matter what happens. He's not going to be impeached now. So unless he loses that majority government sometime during his tenure, which I don't think is going to happen. But back in that time, in the 2016 run, he wasn't impeached over the Russia collusion issue. And we've got to say, if that really had substance, he would have been impeached over it. Because I'd say that is something that was serious enough to be impeached over, and he wasn't impeached over it. So again, minority government would have been impeached over, and I think the fact is that there was never anything in any of the claims, certainly not in the official intelligence documents, that said that he won government because of Russia. What it said was that Russia tried to manipulate the the system, but it never suggested that they won him the election. And there was also the claim, of course, Hillary Clinton's emails were hacked. There was a claim by Hillary Clinton that they were hacked by Russia. Now, that was never suggested in any intelligence briefings. What they suggested was that WikiLeaks. Now, of course, they said, well, WikiLeaks didn't. Their informant was Russian. But that was never proven. And WikiLeaks said that they did it themselves. They had a court case and they proved that. And, the court said, yeah, WikiLeaks did it themselves, which is still a crime. Just got to say, it is a crime to hack. But, and Hillary Clinton had always suggested that not only did Russia hack it, but then they produced emails that weren't her emails. They were spoofed, they were changed. And again, there's no suggestion that that was the case for the ones that WikiLeaks exposed. So essentially, they were looking at apples and saying they were oranges when they were actually apples. And the actual report said they looked at apples and they were apples. But Hillary Clinton, because she wrote a book that was quite a dishonest book about it, and it said, oh, they were looking for oranges and they found oranges, but it was actually apples that they were looking for, and they found apples. So really, the new revelations are not really shedding a whole lot of light on that. They've already had a number of other reviews of this that have already proven that there was it wasn't like that. The new revelations, and this is the Tulsi Gabbard ones, are really not changing it too much because we already knew that Trump didn't win power because of Russia. We already knew that. We already knew that was not the case. Um, but what they've exposed is that this was not just poor intelligence. This was not just a mistake. That this was actually a deliberate attempt to undermine his presidency. And this is the new thing. So we got to say that, and I mean, Barack Obama started it. And this always bugged me because they have this overlap period. So the election's on November 4th, and then the next year, January 20th, they officially have the new presidency. So there's 2 months and 16 days where the old president, he knows he's not going to be there the next time, but he's got to do his handover. Now, sometimes it's the same party, so who cares? But when it's the opposite party, it's 2 months and 16 days where you're in a handover period. And so he used that handover period to start investigations about the person that's coming in. Now, I argue simply doing that, regardless of the reason, is extraordinarily corrupt. And it really undermines the ability for the new president to be a president. It shouldn't be allowed. And now, under American law, it was allowed. And I'm not in any way suggesting that what Barack Obama did was illegal, but I'd say it was inappropriate, unethical, and it really did cause problems. Now they're saying, and look, as far as I'm aware, Barack Obama can't be prosecuted for this, has presidential immunity, and in fact, I don't think anyone involved can be prosecuted. I mean, I'm not completely up to date with all of American law, but as far as I understand, they were all loyal to America, at least loyal to the Barack Obama version of America. They're all doing their duties, and of course, once the investigation began, and they didn't finish till 2019, which was almost the end of Trump's term, and once it began, they had to continue. Trump wasn't allowed to stop it. Now, again, I think that if you were allowed to do it, this should have been there should be a law that says well, it has to stop, or the new president can stop it as soon as he becomes president. And I think that this is very problematic because if you the proper process for investigating somebody who's been elected is to have an impeachment. And they did an investigation on them, which they really weren't shouldn't have been doing. I mean, I'll just compare this. Like the end of 2020, and when Donald Trump lost, he did an investigation about Twitter and Facebook and about them refusing to post the Hunter Biden laptop story and banning people for daring to post it. And they had a Senate inquiry. And then as soon as Joe Biden came in, he stopped it all. It's quite reasonable for Joe Biden to stop it all. He didn't help his presidency. He's allowed to. But the thing is that Donald Trump should have been allowed to stop Barack Obama's investigation into him. And it's really inappropriate to be investigating your own president. And, what's the point of being president if you don't have that level of power? And, and I've gone over the lawfare issues what between his presidential terms. I think they were extremely inappropriate. And if you look around the world, yes, that does happen around the world, but it's always really, really, really desperately inappropriate.